So in today's video, I will be covering the muscles of the face. Now, if we take the muscles of the face, there are two types of muscles. There are muscles of facial expression, and there's also muscles of mastication. These are the muscles for chewing. In today's video, I will be looking at the muscles of facial expression. For the muscles of mastication, I will make a separate video for them. Now, the first muscle I will cover in this video is known as the occipitofrontal muscle. Now, the occipitofrontal muscle is a muscle that has two parts. Now, if I rotate this model around, at the back we can see the second part, which is venter posterior. Now, the part that I highlighted at the start is known as venter anterior. The part towards the back is known as venter posterior. Both the venter anterior and the venter posterior is connected to a connective tissue known as gallia aponeurotica, or in English known as the epicranial aponeurosis. Now, if we move this model back, the venter anterior of this muscle is supplied by the temporal branch of the facial nerve. Now, that is the nerve supply. The arterial supply for this muscle is the frontal branch of the superficial temporal artery. The superficial temporal artery is a direct branch from the external carotid artery. If we hide this muscle and we look at venter posterior, we can say that venter posterior has a nerve supply from the posterior auricular nerve, which is a branch from the facial nerve. Now, do bear in mind that this is not a branch of the facial nerve when the facial nerve can be seen on the face. This is a branch of the facial nerve when the facial nerve is within the cranium, and it splits off early in the facial nerve's root. And the arterial supply for this muscle is done by the occipital artery, which is another artery part of the external carotid. So it's another branch from the external carotid. Now, if I rotate this model back towards the front, the next muscle we'll look at is the procerus muscle. The procerus muscle is a muscle that spreads from the forehead to the os nasi, which is the nasal bone. And this muscle has a nerve supply by the temporal branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this muscle is by the angular artery or the lateral nasal artery. Both these arteries are part of the facial artery. This muscle is known as the depressor supercilii. Now, this muscle, as the name suggests, it's involved in depression, so it's involved in pulling the eyebrows down. This muscle works in a simultaneous fashion with the corrugator supercilii in order to convey the facial expressions such as frowning. This muscle has a nerve supply of the temporal branch of the facial nerve, and it has an arterial supply by branches within the facial and the ophthalmic artery. Now, behind that muscle, we find the corrugator supercilii. Now, bear in mind, this is a muscle that confuses a lot of students, because when medical students go to study this muscle on bodies, this muscle is not usually seen. This is because cadavers are not usually dissected that properly, and also due to the hardship of finding this muscle because it is underneath the depressor supercilii. An example of this is basically seen over here in this side. As I have not removed any muscles, you can see that the occipitofrontal and the depressor supercilii can be seen very clearly, but the corrugator supercilii cannot be seen because it's behind this muscle. Now, the corrugator supercilii is supplied by the same nerve, so it's supplied by the temporal branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply comes from the supraorbital artery of the ophthalmic artery. Now the next muscle is the orbicularis oculi muscle. Now the orbicularis oculi muscle is a muscle that covers the orbit, and it is made up of two parts. So here we have the orbital part, that is the main part of this muscle, and then we also have the palpebral part, which makes up the eyelid. So both these parts make up the orbicularis oculi muscle. Now this muscle is supplied by the temporal branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this is also by branches of the facial artery. Moving down, we can see the muscles of the nose and the area around the nose. Now for the muscles of the eye, I will cover them in another video, but for now we're looking at the nasalis muscle. So the nasalis muscle has two parts. This is the transverse part. Now if we look closely, we can also see another part of the nasalis muscle known as the alar part, or in Latin known as alaris, pars alaris. So both these parts make up the nasalis muscle, and the nasalis muscle has a nerve supply by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and it is also supplied by the infraorbital artery. This artery is a branch from the maxillary artery. So if I remove both parts of the nasalis muscle, you can look at this muscle, which is known as the levator labii superioris aliqui nasi. Now, this muscle is a muscle that is attached to both the os nasi and the upper lip. And this muscle is involved in, as the name suggests, it's involved in elevating the upper lip. So this muscle has a nerve supply of the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this muscle is by the superior labial artery. Now the superior labial artery is a branch from the facial artery itself. If we hide this muscle, move on. This muscle is known as the levator labii superioris muscle. Also, as the name suggests, this is a muscle that is involved in elevating the upper lip. This muscle has a nerve supply by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this muscle is also by the superior labial artery of the facial artery. Moving on, we find another muscle that is very confusing to students because of the positioning of this muscle. Now this muscle is known as the levator anguli oris, and as I said before, just like the corrugator supercilii, this is another muscle that we cannot see on the face that often. This is because of the hardship to dissect this muscle out, etc. So this muscle has a nerve supply by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and just like the others, it also has an arterial supply by the superior labial artery. This muscle is very hard to see because it is underneath both the zygomaticus minor, where we see here, and the levator labii superioris muscle. If we remove this, we can look at this muscle, which is known as the zygomaticus minor muscle. And the zygomaticus minor muscle is a muscle that is attached to the zygomatic bone, as the name suggests, and it's also attached to the lower lip, the upper lip. Now the zygomaticus minor muscle is innervated by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve and has an arterial supply of the superior labial artery. Towards the lateral side of it, we have the zygomaticus major muscle. How I differentiate these muscles is that zygomaticus minor is more medial and zygomaticus major is more lateral. The zygomaticus major muscle has the same nerve and the artery supply. So it's supplied by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply is by the superior labial artery. Moving on, we find the next muscle, which is the risorius muscle. Now, the risorius muscle is a muscle that has a nerve supply of both the zygomatic and the buccal branches of the facial nerve. The arterial supply for this muscle is by the superior labial artery. Now, the risorius muscle is a muscle that is involved in expressing facial expressions such as smiling, because the risorius muscle pulls back the orbicularis oris muscle, which we see here. These are the muscles that make up the upper and the lower lip. So the risorius muscle pulls back the orbicularis oris muscle in order to convey smiling. So this is the risorius muscle. We hide that. Just before we move on to the muscles near the mouth, we can look at this muscle known as the depressor septi nasi. Now, this is a muscle, as the name suggests, it's involved in depression, so it pulls down the nostril, the skin of the nostril, and it has a nerve supply by the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this muscle is by the superior labial artery. Now, if we look at the muscles near the mouth, the main muscle here is known as the orbicularis oris muscle. Now, the orbicularis oris muscle is a large muscle. It is a muscle that makes up the upper and the lower lip, and it is supplied by both the zygomatic, buccal, and also the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. The arterial supply for this is by both the superior and the inferior labial artery. Now, the inferior labial artery of the facial artery will supply the lower part of it, and the superior labial, as the name suggests, will supply the upper part of this muscle. The next muscle is the depressor anguli oris. Now, the depressor anguli oris, as the name suggests, it's involved in depression, so it's involved in pulling the skin and the muscles near the mouth down, and this muscle has a nerve supply of the buccal branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply is by the inferior labial artery. This is the depressor anguli oris. Now we have the muscle known as the depressor labii inferioris. This is the muscle that pulls down the inferior labial muscle. So obviously you have the orbicularis oris muscle, and this muscle pulls down the skin of the lower lip. The other muscle known as the depressor anguli oris, which we removed a second ago, that muscle was involved in pulling the skin at an angle. This is the muscle that pulls the skin directly down. And this is the muscle that is innervated by the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve, and it has an arterial supply by the inferior labial artery. Moving on, we find this muscle directly on the chin, or on top of the chin, known as the mentalis muscle. And the mentalis muscle is a muscle that has a nerve supply by the marginal mandibular artery, the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve, and the arterial supply for this muscle is by the mentalis artery, and the mental artery is an artery by the maxillary artery, so it's a branch from the maxillary artery. Now, if I remove this muscle, that is all the muscles of facial expression covered on the face. Now, if we move to the side, we can also see muscles of the ear, near about the ear. And the first muscle here I will cover is the auricularis superior. So the auricularis superior muscle. So the muscle directly on top of the ear, and this muscle has a nerve supply by the posterior auricular nerve. As we've discussed, the posterior auricular nerve is a branch from the facial nerve, and the arterial supply is by the posterior auricular artery. Now, the posterior auricular artery is an artery that branches from the external carotid artery. Now, the same nerve supply and the arterial supply goes for the auricularis anterior and the auricularis posterior. So these two muscles here are known as the auricularis posterior, and this muscle here is known as, this muscle is known as the auricularis anterior. Now the final muscle on this video I'd like to discuss is this muscle, known as the temporoparietalis muscle. Now, the temporoparietalis muscle is a muscle that has nerve supply by the temporal branch of the facial nerve, and it also has an arterial supply by the superior temporal artery. With that being said, that is all the muscles of facial expression covered. If you like this video, please share this video, like this video, and also subscribe to my channel for new content. Thank you.